All right, good afternoon. I love speaking here because my college has its crest right over the door, over there. I can't see it with these lights, but there you go. Thank you for coming. I hope I can end the day in an appropriately impactful way. I'm going to lean on some of the things you heard in the last talk, actually. I'm going to try to educate you all. I'm going to exploit the fact that education is the most powerful tool to change the world by letting you know something that, to me, it still seems completely incongruous and inexplicable that everybody doesn't know from the age of 2 or 3 or at least 4. Namely, the fundamental nature of aging, what it is, why it's a bad thing, and what we might in principle be able to do about it. The title that I gave to the talk on the program is a bit shorter than this, but ultimately this is what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to be telling you how we can apply to the human body the same principles that we successfully apply in our daily lives to extending the healthy, functioning longevity of simple man-made machines like cars or whatever. I'm going to start with emphasizing something that you certainly already know, the nature of the problem. Now, what I'm showing here is not the problem. What I'm showing here is a cause for celebration. It is that over recent history, we have massively increased the proportion of the population that reaches the age of 65. On this particular graph, just for illustration, I'm showing US statistics from 1950 out to a projection 2050, and it goes up from, as you can see, 8% up to around 22%. This is, of course, pretty much comparable in every industrialized nation. And that's wonderful. We're not having many people dying in infancy or in childbirth and so on. So that's wonderful. But, of course, it does have a very significant consequence. I'm just putting it here in terms of economics. Again, this is US statistics, just because I happen to have them to hand. If we look at the rise in the size of the US economy, that's the red line here between 1960 and 2010, then we can see it's gone up very substantially. If we look at the blue line, that's the rise that has occurred in the amount of money that the USA spends on medical care. And as you can see, it looks ostensibly, if you just look at those two lines, as if it's nicely under control. But it doesn't look nearly so under control if you look at the green line, which is the red line divided by the blue line. In other words, the proportion of GDP which is spent on medical care, that's gone up from around 5% in 1960 to something in the region of 18% a couple of years ago. That is just one way to illustrate the crisis that our success in stopping people from dying in infancy and early in life has created. And it's about time we did something about it. We really need to understand, first of all, why this has happened in the first place. How come is it that the diseases of old age have proven to be so much more recalcitrant, so much more resistant to the interventions of the medical profession than infectious diseases? Of course, we still have some infectious diseases, but most of the infectious diseases that used to do in so many people 100 years ago, 200 years ago, have been virtually eliminated in the Western world, and they've been eliminated by relatively simple techniques, such as the ones listed here. So we must ask ourselves, what is so different about the diseases of old age? And in order to answer that question, we must start by simply asking, what is aging in the first place? What is this thing that we give this name to? And the reason we must do that so carefully and at the beginning of this discussion is because people have a very distorted idea of what aging is. If you ask 100 people for their definition of aging, you'll get nearly 100 different answers, and most of them will not be very useful answers, even if they are, strictly speaking, correct. What I mean by useful is simply they won't actually help us to orient our thinking around how we might develop ways to bring aging under medical control. So this is the definition I'm going to use, which I believe does help us to orient our thinking in that way. Aging is a side effect of being alive in the first place. It is simply the lifelong accumulation of damage that the body does to itself as a side effect of its normal operation, in just the same way that a car does rusting to itself and such like. And again, in just the same way as a car, the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of that damage without significant functional deterioration. But after a while, the damage accumulates to a level which is prejudicial to function, and eventually it causes the body to fail entirely. So that's all that aging is. That leads me to the first thing that I want to educate you about. This is something that people get spectacularly wrong. People do not think of the diseases of old age as being part and parcel of aging, but the fact is that's what they are. How can a disease be predominantly something that affects people who were born a long time ago, other than by virtue of being some kind of late aspect of this lifelong process? That's the only thing it can be. And what this means is that we can't tackle the diseases of old age successfully in the same way that we tackle infections. An infection can be cured. In principle, one can actually identify a one-off, single application intervention against an infectious disease that eliminates it from the body and lets the body get on as it was before the infection occurred in the first place, such that the person will not suffer that disease again unless they get reinfected. You can't do that to things that are side effects of being alive in the first place without curing being alive in the first place, which would rather defeat the object. So let's not do that. But the thing is, there might be another way to prevent the diseases of old age. And that's what we need to look at. Think of it this way. Most people have this view of the distinction between diseases on the one hand and aging on the other hand. They think that there are these three types of disease: communicable diseases, infections; congenital diseases caused by rare errors in the DNA that we inherit from our parents; and the diseases of old age, the chronic diseases, such as Alzheimer's and cardiovascular disease and so on. And then they think of aging as this completely separate thing that's rather diffuse and non-specific and hard to define, that involves things like loss of muscle mass, and that's what sarcopenia is, and decline in function of the immune system. This is how people mostly think about the distinction between aging and disease, and it's completely wrong. This is the way that one should be thinking about it. This is where the big black line should be. There are diseases, but then these things over here in column 3 are only distinguished from the things in column 4 by the fact that we have chosen to give them disease-like names. That is the only difference. They are all part and parcel of aging. Once we acknowledge that, we're well on the way to understanding what we could do about it, and also understanding why it's rather important to do something about it. Another way of saying kind of the same thing is here. On the bottom line here, I have what I've told you already in my definition of aging, that metabolism, which is basically the set of all the things that the body does from one day to the next to keep us going, creates damage throughout life, even starting before we're born, damage that accumulates progressively and eventually, when there's too much of it, causes the various pathologies of old age. And pretty much everything that we have in the clinic today with which we try to postpone the diseases of old age consists of what I'm calling here the geriatrics approach, geriatric medicine, attacking these pathologies. In other words, essentially completely ignoring everything that I've told you in the past few minutes, pretending that these diseases are like infections. And lo and behold, it doesn't seem to work very well. Of course it doesn't work very well. The damage is continuing to accumulate. So obviously the consequences of the damage are going to be more and more resistant to any treatment that one might direct to those consequences, the pathologies. Geriatric medicine is inevitably going to become progressively less effective on a given patient as that patient gets older. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. It was first pointed out probably 100 years ago by various people. And that's what led to what I'm calling here the gerontology approach, which basically says, well, prevention is better than cure. Let's try and postpone the diseases and disabilities of old age by intervening at an earlier stage in the chain of events. Let us try and in some way clean up metabolism. In other words, let us try to tweak metabolism so that it doesn't create damage, or at least doesn't create it as rapidly as it normally does. And that sounds like a great idea. It would postpone the age at which the pathologies of old age actually emerge. A couple of problems. First problem is that it's only going to have significant benefit for people who are fortunate enough to receive these therapies throughout life. If you're already in middle age and you've got a lot of damage already before the therapies are initiated, which would be the case if you happen to be in middle age before the therapies have been developed, then you're not going to benefit very much before the pathologies happen anyway. Unfortunately, there's an even worse problem. Just as the pathologies of old age are very, very numerous, you're not supposed to be able to read this slide, don't worry. This is just a small subset of the things that go wrong with people late in life. Similarly, metabolism is rather complicated. This is, as those of you in the audience who are biologists will recognize, this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. And it's pretty hairy. It's completely inconceivable that we would be able to mess with this system in such a way as to stop it doing the thing we don't want it to do, namely creating damage, without having unintended consequences that did more harm than good, that broke the things we do want this system to do. It's just not going to happen anytime soon. And of course, that's an understatement of the problem. The real problem is not so much that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works. The real problem is that this is a simplified diagram of a small subset of what we know about how the body works, which is completely dwarfed by the absolutely astronomical amount that we don't know about how the body works, right? Even ignoring all the stuff that we don't even know that we don't know. So waste of time. It's just not going to happen. But of course, if that were the end of my story, I wouldn't be standing here. And so we come back to simple man-made machines. This car is about 100 years old. Now, the key thing about this car is it was not designed to last 100 years. Very few cars are designed to last even 50 years, maybe the odd Land Rover. But this car, even though it was designed to last maybe 10 or 20 years, is still going just as well as when it was built. And we have to ask ourselves why, how? The answer, of course, is that its owners are sufficiently in love with it that they do really comprehensive preventative maintenance on it. Really comprehensive. If you do only the amount of preventative maintenance on your car that the law requires, then sure enough, it only lasts about as long as the manufacturers expected it to last before you junk it and get a new one. But it turns out that if you do rather more maintenance than that, this is the result. And of course, it's not just cars, it's any simple man-made machine. So it ought to be the case, since after all, the human body is a machine, albeit a really complicated one, it ought to be the case that the same strategy will work for the human body, just so long as we can develop the strategies for actually putting it in place. And that is what Sense Research Foundation does. That is the concept that I put forward first about 14 years ago and which seems to be gaining some traction suddenly. It's essentially this approach in the middle here. It says rather than trying to slow down the process where metabolism creates damage or the process where damage creates pathology, instead we try to separate those two processes from each other by periodically going in and repairing the damage so that even though it's being created at the natural rate, because we haven't messed around with metabolism itself, nevertheless it doesn't actually reach this pathogenic level of abundance. And I think that's likely to actually be much more feasible than either of the other two. Here's basically why. It's actually possible to describe in relatively simple terms the nature of what we have to do, the types of damage that we need to address. The big realization that led to all the work that Sense Research Foundation does was that all of the various types of molecular and cellular damage, changes in structure and composition that the body does to itself throughout life and eventually contribute to age-related ill health, all of those things can be classified into just 7 major categories. Very manageable number of categories. Here they are. In this very short talk, I don't have time to go into details here, of course, but I can just give you, for illustration, what I mean by these. The top one, cell loss. What's that? It's simply cells dying and not being automatically replaced by the division of other cells. Very simple concept, right? It happens in various aspects of aging. Parkinson's disease is a fine example where a particular part of the brain suffers loss, death of neurons at a rather more rapid rate than any other part of the brain, and those neurons not being replaced causes eventually, in those people unlucky enough to have that happen a little faster than average, it causes Parkinson's disease. The same is true for all of these other things. We can talk about very specific phenomena within the body that change throughout life and that eventually cause to or contribute to the various diseases and disabilities of old age. I'm actually going to go through those and tell you a little bit about that relationship in more detail in a second. But the first thing I'm going to do is to explain to you why I am so confident that this is an exhaustive classification. Because it might not be. There might be category number 8 and 9 and so on, and that would be a bit of a shame, right? But the fact is, we are reasonably optimistic, very optimistic at this point, that this is an exhaustive classification. This is the first reason. It's been the same list for more than 30 years now. All of these things have been major topics of research and discussion among gerontologists since at least the early 1980s. And, you know, that's a long time in biology. We really ought to have discovered category 8 by now if there were one to be discovered. So that's pretty good news. Plus also, it's been more than 10 years since I've been making such a nuisance of myself going around telling people that this is an exhaustive classification and challenging them to actually prove me wrong. And I seem to be getting away with it. You know, this is a description of the problem that seems to be standing the test of time, which is extremely good news. Now, I said I was going to talk about the relationship between damage and disease, and this is actually a really important thing to understand, something that I have found over the years people don't necessarily get unless I really hammer it home. So I'm going to spend a few minutes on this. Sometimes the relationship between damage type and disease type is very simple. Like, well, cancer is the best example of that. So one of my categories of damage is simply the accumulation of cells that you have too many of because they are dividing when they're not supposed to. That's my little two-word description of what that is. And that is more or less the definition of cancer, cells dividing when they're not supposed to. So that's nice and straightforward. But in many cases, the relationship is not so straightforward. Here's an example. Heart disease. A lot of different things go wrong with the heart in old age. There's atherosclerosis, which is caused by the accumulation of particular types of toxic molecule inside white blood cells in the walls of the arteries. That's what I call intracellular junk here. Then there's arteriosclerosis, which is the stiffening of the arteries, causing high blood pressure with all of the various bad consequences that happen as a result. That's caused by the accumulation of molecular crosslinks between the proteins, the elastic proteins that form the major, that allowed the major arteries to respond to the heartbeat. And that's this down here, stiffening of the extracellular matrix. Then there's amyloidosis. It turns out that the heart accumulates molecular garbage of a different type in the spaces between the cardiomyocytes, the heart cells, and this seems, as has only recently been discovered, to be the number one cause of death in the extreme elderly, people over the age of 105 or so. So that's extracellular junk. Finally, some people in whom none of those things are happening, their heart nevertheless just stops in old age, and that's due to this thing, cell loss, because it turns out that there's a very important population of cells in the heart called pacemaker cells, which essentially are the way in which the heart remembers to actually beat in response to signals from the brain, and that signal is no longer adequately heard late in life because pacemaker cells die and are not automatically replaced. So a complicated relationship in this case, but still a very clear, concrete relationship, something that is well understood and that leads to the validity of the model that says that if we fix damage, we're going to fix disease. Alzheimer's, same kind of deal. Alzheimer's, when it was first defined more than 100 years ago, was defined to be the combination of these two things down here. Intracellular junk, in this case, was something called tangles, and something else called plaques, which is outside the brain cells. And we also now know that there's a lot of cell death across many regions of the brain during Alzheimer's, which again is not compensated by cell division. Frailty, you know, the stuff that we don't give disease names to. Again, you can point to various aspects of that, loss of muscle, loss of function of the immune system, and so on. You can actually easily now say what that comes down to in terms of these 7 categories. So it seems to be a very, very clear-cut classification and relationship that really does actually tell us something about the relationship between aging itself, whatever you may mean by that, and the diseases of old age. So now, what about the solution? Well, what is the preventative maintenance approach? The approach that I'm saying is so promising. It comes down to these 4 things here, all of which begin with R: replacing things that have gone missing, removing things that you don't want, repairing stuff that you want that's got damage, and sometimes reinforcing structures against damage. And the specific details are here. Obviously, in the time I have, I can't go through these in detail, but let's just start with number 1 at the top. You all know what the maintenance approach is for cell loss. It's simply stem cell therapy, putting cells into the body that are equipped to divide and differentiate into the form that will replace the cells that had died and not been automatically replaced by the body on its own. If we go down this list, then in each case we have similarly a specific therapy. What I can say, unfortunately, about almost all of those things, other than stem cell therapy, is that they are at a much earlier stage of development. We have a long way to go before they're going to actually work, and that's rather a shame, because it does mean that we've got only about a 50-50 chance of getting all of this working to a really comprehensive, a really adequate level of comprehensiveness within maybe 20 or 25 years from now, which unfortunately is a rather long time, but I'm doing my very best to make that time a little bit shorter. And that's what Sense Research Foundation does. Now, this is a radical idea, even now, even 13, 14 years after I started putting it out there. But it is getting less radical. People with, nice scientific authority, like these 25 people here, our research advisory board, are signing up to it and making very public and very explicit their belief that this really is the way to go. So it's nice, it's quite gratifying that it's not just me going out there talking about the potential to do all this. I think I've got, here we go, a few examples of the publications we've had recently that have illustrated the progress being made in actually putting this together into a viable therapy or a viable panel of therapies. But of course, there is still an enormously long way to go. Oh, I've got that again. No, I haven't. Hang on, there we go. Now, what I haven't talked about, as you may have noticed, is what this means for society. And, I get a lot of this. I get a lot of people saying, oh dear, well, where are we going to put all the people when nobody's dying of aging anymore? And, won't it only be available to the rich? And won't dictators live forever? And how are we going to get bored? And how will we pay the pensions? And God only knows what else I get. And those of you who've paid any attention to my media exposure over the years will know that I have answered these questions once or twice, so I'm not going to answer them today because they're very, very boring. And also because it's not actually what I want you folks to focus on, not what you should be focusing. What you should be focusing on is that we have rather a severe problem today. The problem we have today is that 100,000 people are dying every day worldwide from aging. That's 2/3 of all deaths worldwide. In the industrialized world, it's 90% of all deaths. That is the problem we have. Furthermore, of course, it's not the only problem. The problem is all of the suffering that goes on prior to death, because aging tends to kill people rather slowly. So actually, the fact is that when we consider these problems that I've listed here, or any other problem you may think of, the fact is we have to have a sense of proportion and realize that even if we have so little imagination that we can't think of how society would address these problems, nevertheless, we must compare the magnitude of those problems to the magnitude of the problem that we will be solving. These are the things that we ought to be thinking about when we consider the sociological aspects, the sociological implications of defeating aging with medicine. People will not have Alzheimer's anymore. The elderly will be able to continue to contribute wealth to society, not just have a good time. The elderly will have the energy to continue to explore novelty, which is what you do when you're bored. You'll have a flexible career structure. You can go back to work after 40 years of retirement and become a rock star for the next 40 years. And above all, this is the thing that I have to focus on most when I speak to the elderly. The elderly are petrified of becoming a burden on their kids. And the fact is, most of the elderly do become a burden on their kids. They reduce their kids' productivity as a result of the kids having to look after them. And that won't be the case anymore either. So those are the things you need to think about. If you want more than a 15-minute exposure to all of this, then go and get this book, which was written about 7 or 8 years ago. So you might think it's not very up-to-date anymore. It turns out it is still quite up-to-date, not because nothing's happened. On the contrary, there's been plenty of progress, but rather because the progress that has happened was very much along the lines that we predicted in the book, which is another piece of evidence that this paradigm is standing the test of time. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.